Take three. So you left the ABC in Hobart, went to work for Viz News, the international film organisation in Singapore.
Yes, well, even though I was based in Singapore, I spent very little time there. In fact, the first story I covered was in Borneo, Malaysian Borneo, where the newly formed state of Malaysia was being confronted by Indonesia under President Sukarno. It was called confrontation, but of course it was a war, a mini-war. And I went with British and Malaysian troops. There were a few Australians there too, and Gurkha troops who were attached to the British, of course.
The Gurkhas had a rather good reputation, didn't they?
Very good reputation, well-deserved reputation. Maybe they're the best in retrospect. I think they're probably the best soldiers I was ever with some reservations. That is, they were very, very efficient, very, very professional, carried out orders. They were the complete 100% professionals. The only reservations I had was that they were rather inflexible, and that I saw happen once, where they went into action and carried out the orders of their commander, but the commander was killed. And before his successor in the battlefield could countermand his order to carry out the attack in a different way, several of the Gurkhas had been killed. So there is that inflexibility, but they're very fine soldiers.
There was an incident where the Indonesian soldiers had a machine gun post.
Well, right, they had a machine gun post in rocky, hilly country, very well protected. The only way was to climb around. They had to be somewhat rock climbers, some quite good rock climbers. And the Gurkhas can do just about anything that's called on them to do, and they did this, and that was an occasion where I think they lost 5 dead, simply because the Indonesians were picking them off the rock face.
When they actually stormed these...
Well, eventually they stormed the place and killed them without firing a shot, if I remember rightly. They killed them with their kukri, that's this wide-bladed knife about that long, which is an inverted sort of knife, it's concave, and they can do a lot of damages. It's razor sharp, and they can hook a man's head off or his arm.
I believe that they can't, there's something attached to them too.
Well, there's the tradition that you don't draw the kukri unless you draw blood. So that is, if you ask a Gurkha to show you his kukri, he'll do it willingly, pull it straight out. But then it sort of startles you a little, because before he put it back, he'll nick his thumb or nick his arm somewhere and draw blood. And
that reminds me a little bit of the headhunters, and they immediately come to hand. Were there any headhunters in Borneo?
Yes, of course, headhunting was a favourite pastime before the British put their stamp on Borneo before World War II, well before. And they'd just about wiped it out. But of course, when the Japanese came, the last thing the British told the headhunters in Borneo was that they could hunt heads again in the immediate future, as long as they took the little yellow men whose eyes went down, not up, because they were Chinese and they were our friends, the ones who went down. That was a bit hard for the headhunters, but they were very intelligent people. They've got a number of Japanese heads in their longhouses to this day.
Cut. Cut. This is Wild Track with Neil. Neil, how do you relate to coming back to Australia with all the hustle and bustle around you?
Well, that's the first thing that strikes one coming back from Southeast Asia, where pace is a lot slower. That's partly due to the climate, where it's rather hot, but also due to a philosophy, an approach to life. And to come back to a Western cities with efficient, hard-working, maybe money-chasing to a certain extent, Westerners, is a cultural shock.
Do you think that Australians are too much into the money concept?
I think all Western countries are, without exception. Australia certainly isn't as bad as some other Western countries.
But from the time when you were a boy growing up in Sorel and to the present moment, have we come a lot in terms of our values changing and becoming more money?
Yes, I think it's changed a lot since I was quite young. Mind you, the opportunities have been greatly enhanced with opening up of communications and transport, and life for many Australians has gained a great deal of affluence in the last 20 years, and that probably has a lot to do with it as well.
Can you really relate to all of this around us, the concrete jungle that Australia seems to be going more and more into?
Not really. I would find it difficult to come back and live in an Australian city or a major Australian city. I could come back and live in the countryside because I find that doesn't change much, not at all.
Take 4. Right. How close was Indonesia to falling to the communists in 1965?
It's very difficult to say because, of course, history is written by the victors, who are now the rulers of Indonesia. Certainly there was communist involvement because President Sukarno wanted to involve them in government. They were quite strong. But the army nipped it in the bud, and in the ensuing bloodbath, perhaps 500,000 or 1 million people died.
What did you mainly cover in Indonesia?
Well, it was difficult to cover, of course, the bloodbath. You couldn't get anywhere near that, but there was punitive action by the troops, and of course there were the riots by the students aimed with the army's backing against President Sukarno himself.
What were your impressions of Sukarno? Was it a sad story?
Yes, it was sad. He was a very great man. He was the father of the Indonesian Revolution. Of course, he made many mistakes after he came to power, but I don't think that really touched Sukarno himself. And he was an extrovert and really brought his people out in one generation from being the lackeys of the colonialists or being trodden down by the colonialists to a proud nation.
The riots themselves, what were they like to cover?
They weren't too bad because they were really demonstrations against Sukarno with the backing of the military government which had taken power even though Sukarno himself was still in the presidency. In Saigon, a little later, the Buddhist riots against the Saigon government were much, much worse.
Were there any armed clashes in those riots?
Oh yes, there were armed clashes. A lot of the rioters had hand grenades, some weapons, and of course they really got stuck into it anyway with clubs and anything, axes sometimes.
As a cameraman, what's the basics for survival in a rioting group?
Stay with the troops mainly. Stay with those that have the power. At times you can get with the rioters, but they really don't want to be filmed under those circumstances, remembering that film or photograph can identify them, and they're always very wary about that.
Those Australian journalists that were killed in Timor, what do you think their basic mistake was?
I think their basic mistake was staying. I suppose it was inexperience, because you never stay and wait for the enemy or for the other side to come, because if you're with a certain group, a certain unit, troops, you are their enemy because you're with them, and you don't wait for them to come.
Okay. For the sake of rushing.
No. Sounds really.